Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you also to the previous Maiden speakers of Macclesfield and Great Yarmouth, who gave us very different views of their constituencies but were linked by their love for them. I'm standing here today to represent the people of Witney constituency, and I'm incredibly grateful for them for electing me to represent them, and I will do my best for them. I'm also incredibly grateful for the people who helped me get here. We had a fantastic team that worked extremely hard to do that, so thank you all. And I'm also extremely grateful for my very large family up there. I love you all too. Until this July, Witney voted Conservative for 102 years. Famous parliamentarians from Witney include Douglas Hurd and David Cameron. And I owe David Cameron a backhanded vote of thanks because some of the decisions he made put me on the path to politics. I also want to thank Robert Courts, who worked very hard for the constituency for the last 8 years, so thank you. Our constituency is beautiful. It sits at the bottom of the Cotswolds. It's full of market towns like Farringdon, Burford and Witney that did well off the wool trade, and they did more than trade it. They spun it, they wove it, and it made it into beautiful blankets which were famous throughout Europe since the Middle Ages. Then the dastardly duvet came along, and that was the end of it. But at its best, Witney innovated, and we've got a lot of Methodist roots in town, and they shared technology, and they cared about welfare, and they cared about social justice. And if there's one theme that's kept going today throughout the constituency, are those cares. So there are so many community groups that work so hard, and it's one of the wonderful things about being an MP and being a candidate is you get to see so much of them firsthand. And whether it's the food banks and the larders and the fridges, the sports teams, the day centres, the councils, the churches, you name it, it goes on and on and on. And that network of volunteers is what makes it tick. And they are particularly stretched now because our public services are so underfunded and so stretched. Witney is just 10 miles west of Oxford, and that makes it, for many, one of the reasons that makes it so wonderful to live, work and play there. And that cuts both ways. So we have got enormous pressure from housing. So many people have grown up there but cannot afford to live there anymore, and that is brutal. And then adding to that is transport, where we in our wisdom tore up the railway 50 years ago, and we are stuck on the A40, which now takes more than an hour most days to get between just those 10 miles between Witney and Oxford. And that then doubles down into health. So we've got great GP practices around the constituency, but our secondary healthcare is in Oxford, which is virtually impossible to get to, and that causes an enormous amount of stress. So what we are trying to do is get secondary healthcare out of that hub in Oxford, out to Witney, where we can have redeveloped council-owned land into better healthcare services, more social rent housing, and better further education provision. For the last 4 years, I've worked on the project to rebuild the railway linking Carterton, Witney, Ensham with Oxford. It's a huge project, but we have got an opportunity now, and one of the things that has made it harder and easier is our new government has just said West Oxford's got to take 62% more housing, and that by itself will be a disaster, and it's too high a number. But what we can do if we're clever is do what our Victorian forebears did, which is you can put your housing around your railway stations and use that to fund the railway, and that is what we are intent on doing, and that would get Witney to Oxford in just 16 minutes, so a cut in travel time of 70%. Now, our rivers were our original transport links, and they did very well for our blanket industry and our quarrying industries, but we have not returned the favour. So they are full of sewage, but we are very lucky to have one of the best advocacy groups in the country, WASP, otherwise known as Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, that have done a fabulous job of turning the light on Thames Water and really recognising how dire the situation is. And to give a measure of that, so Thames Water now has got £18 billion of debt, and it's got £1 billion of cash flow. It's in breach of its operating licences, but is allowed to operate by this government with impunity. The sooner that that company is put into special administration, the better. Our constituency also plays a major part in the defence of our country. We've got the biggest airbase in the UK at RAF Brize Norton, just south of Carterton, and we've got the nation's Defence Academy at Shrivenham, in the south of the constituency. Since World War I, the women and men in my family have served our country. They fought for the Army, for the Navy, for the Air Force, for the Fleet Air Arm and the SAS. They've been awarded 1 MBE, 2 DSCs, 3 DSOs and a VC for their courage. One of the DSOs and one of the VCs was for saving lives rather than taking them. And that gives me a lot of respect for what the people in our forces, how they serve us. And at their best, that academy and that Air Force stands up for British values of democracy and human rights and rule of law. And what we need to do in our chamber here is make sure that we also stand up for those and make sure that we don't sell weapons to dodgy regimes. Today's motion is about Syria, and I fully support it because we need to get more humanitarian aid in there. 30 years ago, I visited Syria, and it was wonderful. I was invited to a wedding feast that evening by a chance meeting that morning, and the hospitality was fabulous. 9 years ago, a 2-year-old Syrian boy was washed up dead on a British beach, and this country's grief was enormous. There was a nationwide outpouring. And almost by accident, my family ended up taking quite a few Syrian refugees, and they stayed with us for over a year, and we still stay in very close touch with them today. And that taught us how one of the key things a government can do is make it easy for its citizens to help these refugees come in and integrate into our country and our society. And that's something that we really have done not very well at all. The other thing that it really brought home to me is when a government fails its citizens, it can go very, very badly wrong. And I think in our country we are complacent about how unlikely things can, things won't happen, that won't go wrong. And another trigger that brought me into politics was Brexit. And I started a business when I was 25. I built it over 24 years with colleagues. It ended up being a global business, 9 offices around the world, 7 in Asia, 100 people. And that was through thick and thin, and by hanging in there and trusting people to get things done. But then when Brexit hit, and then beyond that, we were taking out of the single market and the customs union, my experience of business was like, holy cow, this is really bad news. This is disastrous for our economy. It's not going to sink us overnight because we've got a lot of things going for us, but it is a slow puncture. And you see that today in our flat GDP figures, you see it today in our flat investment figures, and you see it in our chronically underfunded public services. Now, I blame our past government for that, but I also look across the benches and I'm shocked because what I see now is a new government defending those disastrous Tory policies of being outside the single market and being outside the customs union. And that is going to, I hear that we're pro-growth, but I'm like, how does that add up? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I really hope, and I say this, in a spirit of kind of constructiveness, that we find a way to get out of that hole pretty quickly, because we owe it to our country to do so. So please, I'd love your help on that. Yeah. The people of the Witney constituency put me here, and they put me here to listen, and they put me here to learn, and anybody who's new in this chamber knows there's an enormous amount to learn. They put me here to speak up for them, but they also put me here to do things, and I've still got to figure out how to get things done here. But I look forward to working with people all around the House to do that. So, people of Witney, thank you again for voting me in to represent you. I will do my